Taylor Elwood here, and welcome to the Submissive Men's Mysteries. And joining me today is Anna Drabick of Project Love. Welcome, Anna. Happy to have you here.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so my name is Anna. I'm currently based in Lisbon. My background is in psychology, and I studied psychology for many years in undergrad, and then I became sort of a student of psychology for the last many, many years. And then I got a master's degree in design strategy. So what I'm doing now is translating all the sort of psychology lessons and elements into tools for people to just experience life and communication and love in a better way. And so that's really what my goal is now.
Wow, excellent. Well, I look forward to digging into that further. Before we go any further, I just want to give a warm welcome to Courtney, Andrea, and Joel. Welcome to broadcast here. As people join us, one of the things that I always encourage people to join us is to feel free to ask questions or drop comments, and I will share those during the course of the interview. So that way, both me and you can respond to them, and that way we also get a little bit of audience interaction and engagement. That's really important. So you and I have been chatting a little bit back and forth on Substack notes. You'll share some really good tips around, communication, limits and boundaries. And I've really appreciated everything you've shared. And so sometimes I've commented on that. And that's one of the impetuses for us connecting on here. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about was basically communication breakdowns in relationships. Like, how do we recognize them? And what is it that we can do about them? So let's just start with that. That's a pretty meaty topic right there.
Yeah, there's so much to say about that. I think that people didn't really teach us how to communicate, There's so many elements in communication. We need to know if someone is high context versus low context. Do you want a lot of information when something is shared, or do you prefer something pithy and simple and just sharing something really simply? That's one element of communication that's really important. There's elements of communication where you want a feedback loop. For example, maybe someone says something to you and you hear one thing because of your worldview, your way of seeing the world, just your experiences in general. And that's going to make your experience very different, right? And so you're going to hear that information in a very, very different way as well. And so it's really important that we understand, like, what is the flow of communication, and having the feedback loop is really important as well. So that's one thing, or those are two things that I think are really important. But when it comes to boundaries and communicating that, I think one of the things that we talked about, and we actually just did in Lisbon, my partner and I just did a workshop a few weeks ago on boundaries. It was amazing because there were so many people who came in, and when it comes to boundaries, it's really less about saying no to other people and being like, oh, I don't want to do this, or this doesn't work for me. And it's so much more about saying yes to ourselves. And I think if we can create a reframe around what boundaries are and what boundary setting is, and saying, it's okay to say yes to myself. That's the goal. I want to say yes to myself, and saying no is okay. It doesn't make me reject someone. It doesn't make me think of them less well. It doesn't make me not like them. It doesn't make me a bad wife or a sister or a daughter or girlfriend if I say no. And I think that just reframing that and trying to look at things as saying yes to ourselves more often and what we really need. I think that's also another form of communication that's really important. So I guess the things that we're kind of talking about are boundaries, feedback loops, understanding whether we're high context or low context in the way that we communicate. Um, and I think we also haven't talked about like how you communicate, right? Like there are some people who really like directness in how they communicate in relationships, and they want to know, okay, this is exactly what I'm looking for. This is how I feel. And then there's other people who sort of tell a story in order to communicate the element. And we have to have understanding and empathy for different ways of communicating. A relationship at the end of the day is just one big communication. Like, you're constantly communicating with one another. And whether it's a romantic relationship or a friendship, it's just or even with family, it's just constant communication and understanding what to say and when to say it and how to honor yourself while also honoring the person in front of you.
A couple more people joined us. Hello, welcome Agnes and welcome Audrey. Again, if any of you have questions or comments as we are going through this interview, we'll be more than happy to answer those and address them. I think you hit on something really important, which is honoring what I call honoring the sacred yes and the sacred no.
Hmm.
The sacred yes to myself, which may end up being yes to somebody else, but may also be a no to somebody else. But also even just the capacity to honor the sacred no as well. When do I say no, for example, to myself?
Hmm.
Because I'm also saying no to somebody else. And I think of it in regards to like people pleasing behaviors, for example, that like someone might come to me and I want to say yes to them to make them happy, but I'm not operating from a place of sovereignty. I'm operating from a place of, like I'm trying to get their approval. And so recognizing that aspect and being able to say, well, okay, am I saying, who am I really saying yes to here? Am I saying yes to myself? Or am I saying no to myself and saying yes to this person, or vice versa? Or how do I say no to this other person and also say no to that part of me that's saying, well, I've got to please this person because I want to make them happy, and that's more important than my happiness or honoring my boundaries or my limits or things along those lines.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I think I used to be that person that was like, I say yes to everything because I am saying yes to life. And then I learned that saying yes to everything all the time actually really drained me. And I wasn't really giving myself enough of the support that I needed and nourishment. And there was a woman who came to the workshop that we ran a few weeks ago, and she basically said, but I want to do all these things. I want to engage in this and this party, and I want to go to this event, and I want to meet this person, and I want to say yes because I think that it's actually by saying yes to other things, I'm also saying yes to myself. And so at that point, I think we have to kind of create our own boundaries within ourselves and our own sort of not limitations, but understanding, okay, where do I draw the line? For example, maybe I give myself 10% of time for friendship. Maybe I give myself 20% of time for exercise. Maybe I give myself 30% for working out or exercise and whatever it might be. So it's like we need to honor ourselves and listen to ourselves. And I think that all goes back to intuition at the end of the day, and honoring what you said, the sacred yes. It sounds like a sacred yes is also listening to your intuition, right? And kind of honoring that, and being able to feel strong enough to say yes to yourself, no to others, and not feeling like you're rejecting or doing anything negative along the way.
Yeah, I mean, I look at the sacred yes as definitely paying attention to one's intuition, and we all have intuition. It doesn't matter how you would like what gender you identify or how you identify as a person. We all have intuition, so it's paying
Hmm.
attention to that intuition, paying attention to that inner that inner voice that just says like, here's what my boundaries and limits are. Because I think otherwise, when we don't do that, it leads to anger and resentment because there's that crossing of the boundaries. And at some point, then it all blows up in some form or manner. And it may not be an obvious fight. It could be just self-sabotaging behaviors. It could be something else, but it's one of the cases where I think that the intuition that we feel, that sacred yes, that sacred no, is an intrinsic part of recognizing like what is most essential to
Hmm.
ourselves that's going to bring the greatest amount of clarity. It's not going to automatically bring joy. I mean, there is an aspect to relationships with other people where sometimes what you're going to say or do and honoring yourself is going to disappoint or upset other people. And I think being willing to brave that storm is just as important as being able to honor yourself, because that storm is a part of life. It doesn't necessarily have to be a horrible thing. It's but a part of it is, can I also handle this person's disappointment, this person's unhappiness, this person in the moment,
Yeah.
and come away walking away with the respect for myself and respect for that person. That's the other key component there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that a lot of us, if we're not rooted in ourselves, we're afraid to do that because we're afraid, okay, how will this other person feel? But also, what if the relationship gets ruined as a result of it? Right. And that can happen because let's say you're in a relationship with someone or you're in a long standing friendship. And this happened to me before where I had a really good friend and I never spoke up about the things that I really wanted or needed. And then I finally started putting boundaries and clarifying them in the relationship. And I actually lost that friend because for her, it was a surprise after 13 or 14 years of friendship. Wait, why is Anna speaking up in this way? This isn't Anna. This isn't our relationship. This isn't how things work between us. And so that was really confusing for her. And I had to, when I spoke up and I had my boundaries, I had to go in and basically accept that the relationship would potentially change. And I think that's the thing that we also have to recognize in general. When we speak up, it's not going to work out for every single relationship and it's not going to work with everyone. But it's really about honoring ourselves. And I think also not being so rigid with our boundaries is also another factor. So, yes, we should honor ourselves and listen to our boundaries, but being too rigid and saying no all the time also doesn't work because I've also found that some people find that boundaries work for them in some ways and they're like, okay, I'm just going to say no to everything now. Like it's no, 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 no. And that's not the point either. So figuring out what that sweet spot is of saying yes to yourself, but also honoring the experiences that come to you and saying, okay, why is this a boundary for me? Where is this coming from? Why do I feel the need to communicate it? I think that's also something that requires some introspection. The same thing as getting into our intuition requires us to be introspective, right? And that introspection, I think, requires some silence. It requires some thinking. It requires some perspective shifting. And when we're kind of in that state of solitude and being able to have some silence around it, that's when our intuition comes along most strongly.
Uh, so to our live audience, again, thank you for being here. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts that are coming up as we're talking, feel free to drop those below. One thing that kind of stands out to me is that there is real power and presence being willing to walk away from a relationship. There's some truth to that, but that there's also real power and presence in being able to check in and say, you know, what are my values around this yes and this no?
Hmm.
Am I saying no because I feel like because I'm having to react, because maybe I'm finally starting to learn how to say no to other people. And so, I'm going to say no to everyone because that's what I need to do in order to grow that muscle. Or am I saying no because I recognize that there's a value conflict here? And this is something that I don't see talked to nearly enough about in relationships and communications, which is really just around the concept of values. Like, what are the values that I have? How am I living a value led life? So when I talk about values, I'll just define it really quickly here.
Hmm.
Like a value for me, for example, is responsibility. And it's not just, oh, I take responsibility. It's actually the central idea around it is I have the ability to respond. I have the ability to make choice instead of just reacting. So I get to choose the response that I have as opposed to automatically reacting. And so that's a huge value to me that steers my yes and my no.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that our sort of non negotiables or our boundaries are based off of our values. And I think that's a very important element. And understanding what your values are, that's really that core, that's where your intuition is going to feel like this is something that's aligned or if it's something that's misaligned. Um, yeah, I don't think it's talked about enough either that we need to first understand the why. And I think the values allow us to understand the why.
So what are what's an exercise or a practice that you would recommend to somebody who's watching this where they're like, yeah, I hear you. I need to get better at, honoring my yes and my no, but you're talking about values now. Like, how would you recommend if they don't know what their values are? And believe it or not, there are a lot of people out there who don't necessarily know what their values are, and
Mhm.
that's not a comment to shame anyone or anything like that. I think it's just
Yeah,
really
yeah.
easy to live a very reactive life. So, what would you recommend for somebody who's hearing this and thinking like, "Wow, this is really hitting something for me. How do I identify that within myself?"
Yeah, so I like to look at it as like where are places that I'm living with from a place of expansion. And so for me, like where have other situations, what makes me feel good? So that's where my values will also come into play. So for example, for me, I really value beauty. And these are general values, but they can also translate to relationships. I value beauty, I value connection, I value respect, and these things all make me feel good. So for example, if we take respect as a value, that can mean different things to different people. But if I feel disrespected, then I will speak up about a boundary, for example. So I would first look at what's most important to me in my life and the relationships that bring me the most joy. So I like to look at this as like the bright spots. What are the elements within the relationship that I really like? Is there an element of consideration? Is there an element of playfulness? Is there which things do I really like? And then I can kind of backbuild my values from there. Another way of looking at what your values are figuring out what hasn't worked for you in relationships or friendships. So, for example, I have a friend that she had dated someone for quite some time, and he was someone who was not generous with his time, with his energy, with his money, with he just wasn't a generous person in her eyes. I can't speak for it, but for her it wasn't. But she through that relationship learned that generosity is something that is so important to her. And that she has friends who are very generous in terms of just sharing their time, their love, their resources. It's not like a, I give you this and you give me this back. It's a very, generosity in its purest form. And so she realized that generosity was a really important element that she wanted to cultivate in all of her relationships. And so if someone wasn't acting in that way, she would explain like why it is important to her. For her, generosity was a signifier of love. So I think that's where values also come into play, where we can understand why it's important to us. So to your for your question of how can people figure it out, I think asking themselves where are their bright spots in the relationships that they do have. So what are the things that they love and value in those relationships? And also potentially in their own day-to-day life. For someone, freedom might be a big value. And that's something that they feel intrinsically, but that's also something that they want in relationships. They don't want to have a relationship with a friend or with a lover that is feeling constraining. They want to always feel like their whole self. They're able to go wherever and be free spirited and not be tied down. And that's something that they're able to, of course, have, right? And so, if you know your value, then you'll also know your non-negotiables or your boundaries because they directly tie into one another. So, for
I think one of
example, yeah, go ahead.
oh, go on, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, if you really value freedom, then one of your boundaries or might be that it would all be around freedom, right? You would say, I like, it's really important to me that this happens or this happens. And I think that kind of brings me to another point about boundaries, like from a place of expansion, like you were saying earlier, that people kind of say things and they say, no, I don't like this, or no, I don't like that. And this doesn't work for me. And it's like, that you can speak in that way. Or, for example, I'll give an example. My mom. My mom is a wonderful human, but she operates sometimes from a state of fear. And so she'll say things to me and she'll bring the fear to me. And I have two choices, right? I can respond to her in a contractive state where I say, um, no, don't talk to me like that. Like, I don't want to have conversations like that because that doesn't work for me. I'm on this path of being more positive and I want to be more focused and I don't want to hear this, right? Like, I can completely draw this like line in the sand. Or I can be more expansive and say, hey, mom, like, thank you for sharing your viewpoints. And I really appreciate them. Like, that's your experience. And I can understand how you could be fearful in this case. But I actually am choosing to see things in a little bit of a different way. So I would appreciate it if you didn't share this kind of negativity with me. Right. So that's a very different way of communicating my boundary. there's the state of contraction that's very like negative and very like, I don't want anything to do, like, it's almost not permitting a conversation to take place versus there's the expansive one that is much more, okay, let me explain this and explain my why and my value along with it, right? So that boundary was about, I don't want to let fear in, but I said it in a better way. And why did I say that? My value is more focused on optimism and more about expansion and positivity.
Okay, so we got a question here from Audrey. Thank you, Audrey. How do you help people determine between their personal boundaries and placing obligations onto others? Oh, that's a really good one.
Hmm. Well, I would say for me, I'm curious about you too, how you would answer this. But for me, a boundary, there's two ways of seeing it. You can say, this is my, it depends, it's very contextual, right? It really depends on what the boundary is too. So let's say I'm saying, this is my boundary and it's important that this is honored because of XYZ, like, and explaining the why I think is important. There's a difference between obligation when you're saying, it's my way or the highway. Like, I think that there's an opportunity with boundaries to actually communicate and have, it's not just a one and done kind of example or scenario. So, for example, with my mom, when I shared that, it wasn't like it was the conversation was done. I shared the boundary and it was done. She then explained her side of it, and she was like, "Well, this wasn't actually what I was trying to do. I apologize. Like, what I was trying to say is this and this is why I'm saying I'm sharing things in this way." Because it comes from my own upbringing and my own way of looking at the world and whatnot. And so we were able to have a dialogue then. And so it wasn't this obligation of like, if you don't do this, I'm never talking to you again. It was just, this is really important to me. And I understand that people don't change within one or two moments. But this is something that's important and I would like you to be conscious of. So for me, I would say, um, personal boundaries are more like, this is something that's important to me and I can explain my why, but I'm not necessarily expecting the other person to um, be obligated to honor them. If they don't honor them, then I need to also rethink my relationship with that person if that thing is so important to me. So I think it's really like context driven. It's like if you it depends on how important that boundary is to you. If that person is crossing the boundary multiple times, I would say that's a relationship that needs to be revisited or a conversation that has to be revisited. But I think in general, it's just important that we hold the boundaries. Like we have boundaries, but we're not so strict where we don't allow others to still be let into our life as a result of it.
Yeah, I think in terms of how I answer that question, one of the things that I really pay attention to is, first of all, the nature of the relationship. You know, the relationship I have with my mom is not going to be the same as the relationship I have with my beloved. It's not going to be the same as the relationship I have with somebody that I'm doing a live interview with, vice versa. Like, you know, there's going to be different things. For example, you and I agreed on a time to meet. That's not
Mhm.
an obligation. It's something we mutually agreed on. We talked
Right.
about it, determined that this was a good time to meet for both of us. Now we're having this live conversation. So there was definitely an establishment of boundaries in the sense that here's this container, here's when we're going to do this conversation. Um, an obligation, on the other hand, would be like if I said, "Hey, Anna, we're going to do the interview then." You're like, "But I'm not able to do that." Well, I'm putting this obligation on you, and I'm using this. It's kind of a silly example, but it's a great one at the same time. Where it's
Mhm.
like it's that obligation, that expectation. I think hidden within obligation is expectation. So being really clear, like on myself, I spend some time really reflecting on like what's the difference between a boundary and an expectation. An
Mhm.
expectation, in my experience, is usually something that has not been voiced, it has not been expressed in a clear and clean way. It creates covert contracts where it's like, I have this expectation that you're going to do X if I do Y. And so there's a transactive element to it as well, which takes away from the strength of that relationship. When I am clear about my boundaries, part of that being clear about my boundaries is also being able to say, like, here's where I'm going to draw the line in the sand. Maybe that could be a very firm boundary, but I think there's also a difference between that. What I see, like, and this is a good example, like with nice guy syndrome, and this nice guys will have either like really hard boundaries or they'll have very porous boundaries, but they don't have that what you're talking about, that the kind of that boundary awareness of like, here's when the situation is good to have a no, and here's where maybe I could, say, like, okay, I don't need to have so much of a firm no, but there does need to be communication here. So the way that I negotiate or really look at that is one, again, going back to that intuition, like what is the inner reality here? And is the inner reality coming from a place where there's some part of me that doesn't feel heard, listened to, or seen? Because we all want to be heard, we all want to be seen, we all want to be understood. That is fundamentally at the core of communication. And so am I paying attention to myself in relationship to whatever's happening here? And am I also really taking the time to make sure that I've conveyed this to this person? And in my particular case, the way I look at it is, am I choosing to respond versus reacting? Because if I'm reacting, I'm going to react from a place of either people pleasing or fear or something else along those lines, and it's going to create a shadow in that communication and relationship, which is going to be, and that shadow is where the sabotage comes into play. So I think all of that is a factor to look at in terms of determining between the personal boundaries. Like what is the value operating here, and what is my response? How am I showing up? Another thing I think is really good that kind of relates to this, and it's something I was going to speak to, is really the value of, in having these conversations, being able to sit down and put together some kind of written document. And not because the written document is like a set in stone type of thing, because I don't think it should ever be set in stone, but rather as a reference point that says, okay, here's what we talked about and what we've agreed upon and not agreed upon. And obviously this isn't going to apply to every single type of relationship, but I think it is important to apply it to the more intimate relationships we have in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Because then there's something that we can look at and review. And again, sometimes it might be, I've got to come back. I have a document with my beloved where it's kind of like our truths. Here are the truths that we have agreed to that feel that feel relevant to us. And we review it every, couple of months, if not even more than that, on occasion, just because it's a good idea to do it and not just fall into this automatic behavior of, well, this is what we've agreed to, and there's no room for discussion or exploration around it.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I actually, I don't know if you know, but I wrote a workbook with my partner, and it's about this. It's about putting, I have it right here, just plugging my book here, but showing it because it's about designing the love that you desire. And we have actually on the foundational element, we have like different elements, but one of them is, what are our values? And why are those values important? And then what are our non-negotiables in the relationship, which are basically boundaries. And we revisit it also every 6 months, because we're like, are we still living according to these values? And do we still have the same non-negotiables? And if not, has something, changed, or has something happened where they need to change? And I think what it does is, this actually came up in the workshop that we did, where if you actually communicate the boundary and you have a similar set of expectations around a boundary at that point, then if something happens, let's say someone crosses a boundary, then you can basically point back to this document or this agreement. It's basically like we have agreements, right, with people, whether they're spoken or unspoken, and or written down or not written down. And we can say, hey, like, we agreed to this, and like this agreement was not considered or was maybe not honored. What do we do about it now? Like, is this a one-time thing? Is this this agreement wasn't met and or was broken, and now we have to rethink the agreement? Or does it mean that it was just a one-time thing and we need to now work on behalf of that? So I think that's the other really important thing about having boundaries. They become kind of like these internal agreements for the relationship. And then you're not creating expectations that are false. And instead, you're actually having these agreements and they're like helping your relationship thrive. So, um, the way that I look at boundaries, and I think I wrote about this recently on Substack, where there were a few studies that were done, and one of them was done in Greece with kids on a playground, and they looked at when the playground was fenced in, how the kids behaved, and they basically they would start to use the fence as a way of like playing and utilized it as like another element. So it's basically the study basically showed how there's freedom within a framework for kids, and we can apply it to adults too. But then there was another really interesting study done on preschoolers, where if there was a fenced in sort of yard at the preschool, then the little kids would play as far away on the grounds as possible. They would explore, they would go and they would see everything. But if there was no fence, they would actually be much closer to the teacher. And it's really interesting because I think that we sometimes think that, oh, putting in boundaries or having these agreements or non negotiables is actually limiting in a relationship or in any sort of context, but it's actually freedom within a framework. That's the way I see it. And every single relationship, the whole point is because you're relating to one another, you can create those agreements together. And they don't have to come out of obligation, but rather they can be co created.
Yeah, I think the way that I like to look at it too is that there's real power in understanding what our limits are and knowing that within those limits, there's actually a lot that we can do. Now, the word limit is sometimes treated as a bad word, so to speak. I see this in different communities like, oh, like limits, limits aren't a good thing or something like that. But there's a reason there are limits in place. It does provide a very specific context that can be helpful in creating the actual experience of freedom within that context. So there's some real value to it. And I love the studies that you mentioned. That sounds really fascinating. Just in terms of looking at that behavior and recognizing that on some level, like what those limits provided was a sense of safety for like the preschool or for those kids where they started to explore their limits too. Like there's also that exploration. Well, how can I work with this limit? What can I do with it? Like those are great examples of that. So what do we do in a situation with communication where we're dealing with like, I'm going to call it like the four horsemen of relationship apocalypse, which is criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, and contempt. What do we do about those kinds of situations? Because those come up sometimes
Mhm.
in relationship. And if there's all four, generally that relationship is more than likely going to fail. I think there's like a 94% chance, according to the Gottmans, as a good example.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really good question. I was actually just talking to a friend the other day, and he was explaining this way of looking at situations and saying, so basically, like it's a very simple framework, but it's just a line across across. And if I'm above, like the question that we ask ourselves is, are we above the line or are we below the line? And if we're below the line, that basically means we are operating from a state of contraction. We are operating in victim mentality. We're operating in sort of this negativity. And everything is, really not, the world against us, essentially, or the relationship against us. But then if we're operating from the higher plane, so basically just above the line, we're operating from a state of expansion. So it's curiosity. It's, it's inquisitiveness, it's openness. And I think that what you mentioned, like the four horsemen of criticism, defensiveness, all these other elements, I think if we're operating from a standpoint of, I'm curious, I'm not judgmental, I actually just want to understand the situation better. I'm open to learning, and we come into situations with more beginner's mindset. I think that honestly, that foundation helps any sort of relationship thrive. And that we get rid of our defensiveness in that way because we're instead of when someone pokes at us and they say something, we don't look at it as, oh no, I did something wrong. We actually look at it as, okay, th- this person is saying something. What can I learn from this experience? It doesn't mean that they're right, but is there something I can learn from it? Can I have a conversation about it? Can I understand more deeply? And so I think that if we can look at things from this really simple framework of like, am I coming at it from curiosity, openness, wanting to understand more? Or am I coming from it as like, I'm a victim and everything's negative? And, that's where the communication breakdowns actually happen. The communication really like expands and it's really prospering when we're in that higher state.
Yeah.
But
I know
we
for
have
myself,
to
oh, go on.
No, but we have to, I think that there's a big piece of self awareness that is really important in order to be in that state of curiosity and openness and inquisitiveness. We have to first determine where we are. Like, it's okay sometimes if we find ourselves in that victim mentality. So we have to first see, okay, where are we? Maybe we are in victim mentality. Can we accept that we are in victim mentality right now? And then third, are we open to moving from victim mentality into this positive expansive state? So I think those are kind of like the three steps of it. Because for example, defensiveness, I would say that I'm a pretty open and yeah, I'm a very open person and very curious. And yet when you're in like a very close relationship, whether it's with a really good friend or at work or with a romantic partner, and someone says something to you and they say it's not the highest compliment, I think a lot of us will shrivel up initially and be like, wait, why did this person say that? What does it mean? And then we'll poke back. We'll say something, to either defend ourselves and we build this bridge and this blockade around our heart. Um, or we basically try to turn it on them, right? Which is also like gaslighting and not fair. But I think a lot of the time, if we're not self aware, we'll go into those states. So self awareness is so important in all these communication breakdowns.
hmm Yeah, it is. I think there's something really powerful to be said for recognizing, the self-awareness. This kind of goes back to what I said earlier about reactivity versus responsiveness. Like I know when
Hmm.
I'm caught up in reactivity because reactivity looks like feeling overwhelmed. It looks like making choices that are kind of knee jerk, reactions to kind of to deal with things, but actually end up creating worse of a situation.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that there's something to really be said also, and this kind of goes back to an earlier point of being willing to lean into conflict. When I say this, I don't mean like, okay, get into a knock 'em, sock 'em out, yelling type of thing, but I mean being willing to be uncomfortable with the person that you're with
Yes.
and lean
Yes.
into that discomfort with curiosity
Mhm.
and a genuine desire to learn. Like, what am I uncomfortable with? What is this person uncomfortable with? What can we do to actually be in that discomfort and come out the other side
Yeah. No,
together?
yeah, that's a really good point. And I think I personally did not deal with a lot of conflict in my family growing up. And so when I saw conflict, it was always sort of shielded from me. And so I thought, oh no, conflict is bad. This means an end of a relationship. If I speak up, if I say something's wrong, then this person is not going to want to be in my life anymore. Maybe I'm going to break a relationship. Maybe a friendship is going to, maybe a friend is going to no longer want to be my friend. And I think that having the courage to see conflict as not a negative, but actually there's something that is off balance and we need to kind of rebalance. But the only way we can do that is through curiosity and conversation. And I think that having, um, like also boundaries within conflict is really important. So like people argue in different ways and people have disagreements in different ways. But for me, it's always been really important that it's done with clarity and kindness and as calm of a um, energy as possible. And I think to your point, like that just means you cannot do it in the moment. You can't, if you feel this energy moving up within you and you know that it'll potentially be negative, it's not a time to do it. If you're also there, it also depends on attachment style, right? Some people are very conflict avoidant. And that's typically also like avoidant behavior, and they don't want to talk about conflict ever. And so, maybe that person, if they're working on their sort of attachment style and their conflict resolution, maybe they need a little bit of time to process, to journal, to experience the conflict through their own eyes and through their own intuition first, and then come back and talk about it. I'm not someone who needs to talk about something right away. I'm someone who actually really likes to have a day or two to really process it, because I want to be able to say things from a kind way, kind perspective. I don't want to be defensive. I want to have processed it enough on my own that I can show up as my best self. But for example, my partner wants to talk about things right away because for him, conflict resolution, the faster, the better, you know? And so we've had to also find a happy medium with that, which I think is interesting because different people have different, not just conflict style or, maybe not avoiding it, but also the time in which they want to speak about a potential conflict.
Mhm. I want to welcome Krupa and Sheena to here. Sheena's my beloved. Welcome. And then again, for anyone who has questions or comments, feel free to drop those in as we keep talking. I think you make a really interesting point. Different people have different styles of, how they handle conflict. I'm like your partner, where it's like if it comes up, I want to resolve it as soon as possible. And it's interesting because a lot of times when I look at conflict with myself or with clients or just in general, what I find is that a lot of it is related to kind of going back to the attachment wound.
Hmm.
So for me, I can say that like, okay, like wanting to fix it as quickly as possible or wanting to get to a resolution as quickly as possible is really kind of based around an am I okay with, can I be okay with this person?
Hmm.
Because I don't want to live in tension with this person. And I can easily point back to where that is, and my family system growing up and all that other fun stuff. But what I've done with that, and I think it's really important, is I've learned to kind of, as I've become more aware of these things, is I've learned to really sit with that and be like, okay, I'm not, X age. I'm not 7 years old or whatever age it is. That inside part of me that's wanting to like, I got to fix this right now. That's where that part's coming from. So it's having a relationship as well with the part inwardly that, like, in terms of conflict, might be like, well, I need to do X, Y, and Z as quickly as possible. Well, maybe not.
Hmm.
Maybe it's okay to that part, like, hey, I get it. I see you. I hear you. I understand this is going on and there's some tension here. And let's let's connect. Let's have our own conversation. And let's come back to that and know that you are okay, that I've got you. And that I love you and that I'm here for you no matter what. And then take a breath and then let's go and look at this situation with this other person, but from a place where we're not operating from 7-year-old, or whatever age it is. Again, it's
Yeah.
not everyone's age is going to differ accordingly, but I think that that's a really important element to recognize in all of this.
Yeah, and I think that also goes back to that like very simple framework that I was talking about where it's like, am I above the line or below the line? And if I'm below the line, I'm going to be anxious. I'm going to be like, I need to solve this immediately. I don't feel good inside. So can I give myself the time to come from a more expansive state of, I'm curious about this. I want to solve this. Like, I want to be able to compromise. And I think that's the key to really come to all of these communication experiences from an expansive state.
Hmm. I want to welcome Sarah as well, who just popped in here. Welcome. And again, thank you to everyone who's here live. You know, I really appreciate it when people come to these interviews because then it's like, okay, we've got some interaction here. Again, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop those in. Now, you mentioned a book earlier and you briefly plugged it. I want you to hold it up. Let's actually take a look at this book.
Oh, yes. I
I
love
love
pen.
playing it. So tell me a bit about this book. How did you come up with it? What was your thought process behind it? And where can people find it?
It can be found on our website, which is mastersinrelationship.com. But basically, what happened was I grew up in a family where we didn't talk about anything. My parents didn't talk about what they were looking for in a relationship. They didn't talk about conflict resolution styles. They didn't talk about how they wanted to communicate or what their big dreams were. It was sort of like they connected because they were both Polish. They both wanted a family. And it was sort of like, let's go. Let's see where it goes from here. And there's no blame for that. Obviously, it was a very different time. My parents immigrated from Poland to the United States when they were quite young. They met there. And they didn't have the same privilege of being able to work on themselves the way that we've been able to, right? Like, we're also living in the internet age where so much information is constantly shared with us. And so we're able to up level much more emotionally than a lot of other people have been able to, especially like my parents and grandparents. So I'm very grateful for the situation that I'm in and being able to be more conscious about relationships. But I learned kind of the hard way by seeing my parents' relationship fall apart. And for my partner, it was a very similar situation where his parents never spoke about things. It was sort of just the relationship was maybe more transactional than it was like about developing like conscious love. And so when we got together, we realized we're like, you know what? There's so many relationships that we've had before in the past that didn't work out. And the reason why they didn't work out primarily were maybe we could have been different, but we didn't talk about how we were different. We didn't talk about what our desires were. We didn't talk about what we were hoping for in the relationship. We didn't talk about where we wanted the relationship to go. And I think that that's where communication comes into play because we're constantly communicating in a relationship, right? But if I just realized very recently that I wasn't communicating very often in my past relationships. I was sort of just going with the flow and seeing how things were going. And then if I didn't feel a certain way, I would throw it under the rug and I would then build that resentment over time. And then one day I would just kind of be over it and just not want to be in the relationship anymore. And so I think in an effort to combat that and just understand how the brain works, also how the dopamine system works. And for example, the first 18 to 36 months of a relationship, you have all this dopamine and all this serotonin. And then it moves and it changes. And a lot of people at that point are like, oh no, the relationship isn't exciting enough. It's not, it doesn't have like all the elements that I'm looking for. And I actually just wrote about the dopamine challenge of dopamine recently because in relationships, just because we're living in this dopamine world. And so we're constantly thinking that we need this stimulation in order to be happy. And so basically, the book is twofold in terms of it focuses on communication and the practices and the things that we should all talk about. But then it also provides little elements and little bursts of serotonin through small practices and other things that and just planning. So it's, for example, it's really nice to have a bucket list with your partner. And the reason that is because it's actually been known to create more connection. When you do certain activities together, you build memories. Those memories kind of act as a long-term dopamine system or are impacted by the dopamine system longer term. As like, oh, this happened. Do you remember that? There's a shared connection in these things. So it's both looking to the future and creating kind of a system where we can add more playfulness and dopamine, like that natural dopamine and excitement into our relationships as they move on, while also having all the difficult conversations. And I think that's the thing that I think is missing a lot of the time. We weren't taught the conversations that we should have and how to have those conversations with partners, but also with friends, with family. And I think we're all learning. So the book isn't perfect. It's like our first version. And I think that that's part of it. Like love is not perfect. Relationships are not perfect. They're a work in progress. And we want to make sure that, like we're on the journey with everyone else, but we wanted to create something that resonated with others and could be used as a powerful tool for self-inquiry, but also, connection with your partner.
That's excellent. I think that's important. Something you hit on there that kind of occurred to me too, like, with dopamine, like why sometimes people get addicted to conflict in relationship is because that's how they get the dopamine hit in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually, conflict is super interesting because I had a partner once and I've always believed that arguing, or I don't say arguing in terms of there's never like anything negative in that. Like it's just communication. I think some people think that like it's never, for me, conflict is never abuse. It's never like emotional abuse, physical, nothing like that, right? Conflict is just disagreement, right? And so I just think that that's important to make clear. But I have always seen conflict as okay, we either talk about it very simply and seamlessly, or we don't talk about it because I learned to not talk about it. And so now I obviously see it as something that can be done in a conscious way. But for my partner back in the day, he learned that conflict was yelling and screaming, and like that was how you argued, and that was how you showed love. That was his way of showing love. And so I remember we were making dinner one night and he started to get very frustrated and he wanted to talk, and then he started getting more animated and more frustrated, and I was just really calm and just kind of listening and answering him, and he looked at me, he goes, "Why don't you love me?" And I looked at him and I was like, "What do you mean? Of course I love you." And he's like, "But you're not yelling. There's no passion here. There's nothing that you're showing me that you love me." And I was
Uh-huh.
like, wow, we have such a different way of experiencing love, but also experiencing conflict because of where we come from. And so this goes back to our limbic system, right? So in the brain, we have our reptilian brain, our limbic system, and our neurocortex. And when it comes to love, the imprints are made on our limbic system. And so whatever we experienced as a child, we typically go back to that sort of, whether it's conflict or whatever love felt to us back in the day, that's sort of what we tap into. Unless we're able to recognize it, have self awareness around it, rewire it, which I think is really important. But the great thing is that there's a way for us to change our limbic resonance. For example, like if we're around other individuals who are um, kind of healthier and can soothe our nervous systems, our limbic systems can actually get acclimated to that and change. So there's a lot of neuroplasticity that's obviously possible.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's really important, and recognizing that. I once had a partner I was with too, who kind of was like, "Well, fighting's my love language." It's not mine. But
Yeah.
it was an interesting conversation because it was just like it was like, okay, it was a good indicator that our values didn't match, but it was also
Yeah.
kind of a fascinating interplay. So I think yeah, it's a fascinating thing to explore and to recognize that why people do what they do. There can be many different reasons and things that we don't even recognize on the surface, but nonetheless are important to the people. And sometimes it doesn't come out until we have an engagement, just like what you mentioned right there.
Yeah. No, it's really true. And I think at the end of the day, every single relationship is teaching us so much. Every relationship is a mirror to us. It's showing us our blind spots. It's showing us where we perhaps need to work on things, where we can grow, how we can evolve, whether it's with communication or conflict or anything. And so I think that's the beautiful element about relationships. They're our greatest teachers.
So, Anna, as we wrap up this interview, I want to thank you, first of all, for coming on. I really appreciate it. I've enjoyed our interaction via notes and on Substack. And where can people find you on the web?
I have my Substack called Project Love. And then we also have our website, www.mastersinrelationship.com. And that's also linked on my Substack. And then you can find a bunch of actually free resources around communication and conflict resolution. I have some handouts on there too that are just a simple download. And then, yeah, always open to a conversation or collaboration because this has been super nice.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I feel like our conversation went in so many different directions, like from studies on children and boundaries and just communication and boundaries and like love in general. So, yeah,
Well,
super
that's
nice.
kind of fun of this stuff. I like going in different directions. And I have one final question for you, which is, can you share a final word of wisdom or a phrase or something that we can carry with us into the day forward?
Okay. Let me think. Hmm. I think the quality of our relationships depends on the quality of our communication. So I know
Mm,
Esther Perel talks a lot about the quality of our relationships affects the quality of our life, and I agree with that. But I think the quality of our communication affects the quality of our relationships.
mm, heard and agreed.
Yeah,
Well, again, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed this. And for those of you who came on live, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This will be going out a little bit later today as far as the recording goes. And I look forward to seeing you on Substack.
amazing. So nice.
All right. Take care.
Okay, talk soon. Bye.